My name is Elizabeth Landau, and I'm the Public Affairs Manager at the American Geophysical Union. I hope that you're all here because you're interested in communicating with policymakers. And I'd like to take a few minutes just to tell you about some of the opportunities that AGU presents to our members to allow you for communications with your policymakers. We have congressional visits days in Washington, D.C., and we also have an event in the summer where you can visit your legislators in your home district. And we welcome all of you to get involved in that. There's a sign-up sheet out at the front table if you're interested in getting some information on that Congressional Visits Days event. We have 3 of those per year. In addition, we offer 2 Congressional Science Fellowships each year, which is an opportunity for you to work in the office of a senator or representative or a committee office on Capitol Hill for 1 year. We also send out science policy alerts, which are emails we send out about once a week, depending on what science policy events are happening and what important science issues are happening on Capitol Hill right now. So if you'd like to sign up for those alerts to get in your email inbox, you can do so on the sign-up sheet outside the room. In addition, we have a new program, which is a science policy conference, and this is held in the spring or summer in Washington, D.C. each year. Our next event will be June 24th to 26th, 2013, in Washington, D.C. So we hope that all of you will check that out and see if you can attend that event. The website for that, for more information, is spc.agu.org. So there's more information on our website if you're interested in any of that, or come talk to me after the event. But I'd like to go ahead and turn things over to our panelists, who are experts in the science policy interface. Each one will speak for about 5 minutes about the role of scientists communicating with policymakers and giving you some tips and tricks for being able to best communicate with that audience. And then we'll open the floor for questions and answer. And I know all of them are looking forward to your questions. So just to give you a brief introduction of each of our panelists before we begin, our first speaker will be Kasey White, who serves as the Director for Geoscience Policy for the Geological Society of America, where she leads GSA policy activities. She previously served as the Project Director in AAAS's Office of Government Relations, where she focused on climate change and environmental issues, as well as the use of science in policy making. She recently authored Working with Congress, a book to guide scientists in their policy involvement, and she also worked with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change as the co-editor of Climate Change 2001, Impacts, Adaptation, and Vulnerability, and was the lead author of the technical summary of the report. Our next speaker will be Jay Gulledge, who is Deputy Director of the Environmental Sciences Division and a member of the Climate Change Science Institute at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, where he provides strategic scientific leadership for devising sustainable solutions to energy and environmental challenges. He's also a senior advisor for the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, where he previously served as director of the Science and Impacts Program. In 2011, he received the AGU's Charles S. Falkenberg Award, which honors a scientist under 45 years of age who has contributed to the quality of life, economic opportunities, and stewardship of the planet through the use of earth science information and to the public awareness of the importance of understanding our planet. Our next speaker will be Linda Rowan, the Director of External Affairs at UNAVCO Incorporated. Previously, she was Director of Geoscience Policy at the American Geosciences Institute, where she worked at the intersection of the geosciences and policy at the federal level and managed internship and fellowship programs. She taught a course on earth science and policy as an adjunct faculty member of the Atmospheric, Oceanic, and Earth Sciences Department at George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia. Before diving boots first into public policy, she worked as an editor at Science Magazine and a postdoctoral researcher at NASA Johnson Space Center. Our final speaker will be Maggie Walser, who is currently a program officer with the Board of Atmospheric Sciences and Climate at the National Academy of Sciences. Maggie was the 2008-2009 AGU Congressional Science Fellow. During her fellowship year, she worked with the majority staff of the Senate Committee on Energy and Natural Resources. And with no further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Kasey.
Great, thanks Liz, and thank you all for coming out today. I'll just go ahead and give a little bit of an overview of ways that scientists and policymakers can interact and the 2 main ways in which that happens. One is science for policy, and the other is policy for science. And if you think about it, policy for science is things that Congress and the administration do that directly affect the conduct of science. Federal funding for research is probably the one that people think of first. How much money is available at the National Science Foundation or at NOAA or NASA for your research? But there's also a host of other issues that really impact how science is conducted, things like public access policies, visa policies for foreign students, education policy. So there are ways in which Congress really dictates the way scientist is conducted. And those are areas which scientists, of course, have a huge voice. I just heard a saying yesterday, if you're not at the table, you're on the table, which I think is very true, and scientists need the research funding, and in these austere budget times, I think it's really important for scientists to have a voice on things that really affect them. The other issue is science for policy, and those are issues, when you look at the issues facing our nation, so many of them have a really strong scientific component and a geoscience component. Things like climate change, energy policy, mineral resource development, natural hazards, all really depend on a strong understanding of the science. And I think geoscientists have a really critical role to play in these as they bring forth the science that underpins these decisions. If you look at Congress, many members and their staff are generalists. There's very few scientists in Congress. They're dealing with a whole host of issues. The staffer who covers science also probably covers Veterans Affairs and agriculture and just a whole range of subjects. So they really need people they can trust. And as a scientist, you can bring that credibility on the science on these important issues by building a relationship with your member. I do want to just mention one caution as you do that, though. I think sometimes we all think, well, my member of Congress only understood the science better, he'd vote differently. If he only understood what was happening on climate change, of course they would implement cap and trade or whatever your policy is. And I think it's very important for scientists to engage in the policy process and bring their science to bear, but also recognizing the constraints of the political system and how many other factors members have to deal with as they make votes on these important issues. They have to deal with re-election, what their constituents think, values. They have to deal with economics. So science is not the only factor that makes a decision, but it is a really important one. And with the knowledge you have of these scientific issues, it can play a really important role in policy. So I'll hand it over to Jay now to hit on how you do this effectively.
Well, so I'm here because I played a role in an issue-based organization rather than a science-based organization, and so I look at it through that lens, which is somewhat different. I still look at it as a scientist, but somewhat different than looking at it from AAAS or GSA or AGU. And so I just want to sort of give some general insights that I think I've learned over the past 8 years since I first started doing this kind of work. And the first is that communicating science to decision makers is not about teaching science. And I know that when I 8 years ago thought, hey, maybe I want to go to Washington and work at the Science Policy Interface, I thought, I get good reviews from my students on my teaching. I'm a pretty good teacher. I bet I could do this well. And the irony is that and it's not that some of the skills of teaching aren't useful. They are. And sometimes you need to teach during the communication of science. But that's not the point of it. The point of it is to inform with relevant information a policy debate without choosing sides in the policy debate. And so that's not the same thing as teaching science. It means you really have to get to the point. You have to be speaking to the things that your audience is interested in, not the science you love the most. And so it's a bit of a different thing. I want to also just reinforce something very important that Kasey said, which in everything that Kasey says is very important, but this one is something I connect with. It's not a problem. If you think that decision makers are not embracing the science in their decision making, it's not because there's a lack of information. It's not because they don't understand it. They might not understand it, but that's not why they're not embracing it. And I think it's so important to understand that I think one of the biggest reasons for our failure as a community to communicate, when we don't always fail, but when we do, is that we have that notion that if the public just understood science, if the policymakers understood the scientific process, they would make better decisions. by believing that myth, we misframe our communications and we fall into the trap of thinking that we need to teach science. And so that relates back to my first point. So what is your role? In my view, or at least this is all from experience. I'm not a scholar on this, but I think that your role in science communication is to, as I said, deliver information that informs a policy debate and maintain your credibility while you're doing it. But how do you inform a policy debate in a way that interests your audience? The first thing you do is not teach principles, science. The first thing you do is tell a decision maker why you think they should care from their perspective about what you can tell them to get their attention. Second thing would be that they want to know is, all right, what can you tell me that is of use to me? And third, what don't you know that would be useful to me if you did? Fourth, how long would it take you to learn that? And fifth, what would I need to do to help you? And then last, well, how do you know that? What's the science behind that? Now, you do need to do that at times, but it's not what you're there to teach. So that's just my take on it. One of the most common questions I get is, what about uncertainty? How do I balance telling what I know versus talking about uncertainties? And the main point I want to make is you have to cover the uncertainties. Not only because your credibility depends on it, which it does, but also because it's useful information for decision making. Now, to make it useful, you have to process it and characterize it really well. But it is important information for decision making. Do lead with what you're confident about. Do not omit the uncertainties, though. And if you walk away from a conversation with a decision maker and the decision maker, you think you've delivered actionable information and the decision maker says, well, there's nothing actionable there, then you have to think about how you delivered, where you went wrong and not portraying your own confidence. And my last point, this is a bigger issue. It's not something an individual can solve. We have an issue with our community in the sense that if we want our science to matter, in many cases we're just not doing the right science. And if you're going to offer that information that really addresses the policy debate, you need to do it in a way that your decision makers agree that it addresses the policy debate. The problem is that our science is not driven by that. It's driven by our own curiosity and what we think the next logical question is for understanding the universe that we study. So you might have to do some boring science that isn't really highly rewarded within your community if you really want your science to matter in some cases. I don't mean to be a wet blanket about that, but it's something to consider. And I'm sorry, I do have one last point. Science communication should not be every scientist's job. Okay? It's just, one, we don't need it to be everybody's job. We don't need every science. We got thousands and thousands of us. We don't all need to be out there trying to communicate what we know. We all, within a field, most of us know the same stuff, at least the stuff that matters to a policy debate. We need people who are really naturally good at it, who have the time to go to all the AGU training events and get better at it, and who will cooperate with folks like Liz and Kasey and take their cues and be coachable. And that's just not everybody in science. So that's my last point. Thanks.
Okay, I just came from Washington, D.C., and now I'm working in UNAVCO in Boulder, Colorado, which is quite beautiful. And so when I was in D.C., though, I did learn that you needed to have talking points and bullet points, and you had to be very concise when you communicated with Congress. So for my presentation, I have a series of bullet points that I'm just going to give you that are essentially some tips for those of you who are scientists who would like to communicate with Congress in particular. So my bullet points, here's my first one. First of all, be positive. Try not to make a statement that's negative. Like don't start with, we have these uncertainties and we really don't know the answer. Put it in a positive perspective. Be concise. Try to be non-technical, but be a little geeky. And the reason I say be a little geeky is because you are a geoscientist. And you want them to understand that you are a geoscientist, and that's a good thing. And they actually, I have found when I was working in Washington, that when I said to a staffer that I'd like you to meet with a geoscientist, many of them were actually enthusiastic, because a geoscientist is a little unique for a congressional office to hear from, and they think of geoscience as kind of cool. So I think it's a good thing. You can be persistent without being annoying, okay? Because sometimes you have to repeat your message over and over again in order for someone to either get the message or to get the message to them at a time when they can actually do something about the message that you're presenting. Communicate regularly, which is also kind of about being persistent. And you don't have to go to Washington, D.C. You can call or you can email. That's a perfectly effective way to reach somebody. Do not tell them how to write policy or how to debate with their colleagues. All right? You are there as a geoscience expert, so you can talk about the geoscience. And you can give them ways that it can be helpful for policy. But your role, hopefully, is to provide sound geoscience for policy making. Do not suggest cutting other things or be negative about other areas of funding or things like that. You can visit a district office. You don't have to go to Washington, D.C. There's district offices in all the states. You can offer a tour of your facilities, or you can offer to have them visit your institution. That's also a great way for them to become more familiar with what you do. Prepare simple one-pagers. In D.C. they're called one-pagers. It's basically one piece of paper that typically has bullet points and a lot of nice figures. Become familiar with the legislation that you might want to talk with them about. You don't have to do a detailed study or a lot of research, but it would be good to be familiar if you want to talk about either funding or some policy-related legislation. Use AGU, GSA, and other resources. They all have great programs on communicating with Congress. They can help you. You can call Liz at any time, and she can help you. And also, last but not least, be aware that there are many other issues that policymakers are dealing with. Healthcare, poverty, well, they really haven't been dealing with poverty, but healthcare, many other issues. And so while you're there to talk about geoscience, be aware that there are many other issues that they're dealing with. And although you can give them some of the geoscience reasons why policy should be made, there may be other factors that play into that decision making. And that's all I have.
Okay, so as I feared being at the end of the table, everyone's made fantastic points. And so I would like to reiterate everything that everyone has said. And now I assume that after hearing the great comments, you're all fired up and ready to go talk to Congress. And so I think ways to get involved. So Liz mentions all the ways through AGU that you can get involved. There are congressional visit days 3 times a year. And I think that's a really good way to kind of ease into talking to Congress, because AGU offers training. It's a very structured environment. As Jay mentioned, they will coach you, and you get some practice in keeping things simple and talking to staffers. I think a common, from my perspective as a former fellow who worked on the Hill, a common mistake that scientists will make when they come and meet with staff on the Hill is they see staffers, most of whom are very young, and who are non-scientists, but just because they're younger than you and or not a scientist does not mean they're stupid. All of them are very smart people who cover a broad range of issues, and I think sometimes scientists make the mistake in simplifying their message of going too far and condescending to the person that they are talking to, and that's something that you want to avoid, because if you walk into a meeting and the staffer gets the vibe from you that you think that because they're not a scientist that they're not as smart as you, that you're going to offend them, and they're not really going to listen to your message. To reiterate what Linda said about not necessarily needing to go to Washington, D.C., I guess this session is about talking to Congress, but you don't necessarily have to talk to Congress. You could talk to policymakers at the local and state level, and that can be just as important as talking to your congressman. I think this is not AGU, but the AMS, the American Meteorological Society, runs a really great program in the summer. I think it happens in June. It's a 10-day summer policy colloquium. It's essentially government boot camp for scientists. So you can apply to the program, and you come to DC, and you stay there for 10 days. It's a long 10 days, but you learn a lot. So they bring in speakers from federal agencies, from congressional offices. They do a couple case studies on different science policy issues. You get to practice briefing a member of Congress and offering an opinion on the way your imaginary congressperson should vote on a specific issue. So I think if you're really fired up and want to get really involved, it's a really useful program. And also, I'll just have to plug the Congressional Science Fellowship Program. I think if you want to do a little more and spend a year in Washington, it's a really great way to get a lot of experience in policy making and really understand the process.
I'd just like to reiterate what we've been saying, that AGU is here to help you out with this process. If you have questions, if you need some help, if there's anything that we can provide for you, we're here for that. So please do let me know, grab one of my cards, contact me. We're happy to work with you.